I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week's guest is Caroline Ball, author of a beautiful book called Heritage Apples. In normal circumstances, this week would have seen lots of events to celebrate Apple Day taking place across the country, but instead, I'm celebrating here on the podcast by delving into some of our lesser known and more historic varieties with Caroline. Plus, there's a very useful bit at the end where Caroline explains the mysteries of apple tree pollination. I start by asking Caroline the question, what is a heritage apple?
The difficult ones first. Unlike antique silver, say, or veteran cars, there are no clear parameters that says one apple is a heritage variety and another one isn't. Modern varieties bred, say, since the war are pretty unlikely to be considered heritage by anybody, and varieties developed outside Britain, definitely not. Although places like the United States and Australia do have their own heritage or heirloom apples, and but they're quite different from ours because they've been bred in those countries. So it's historic sounds as though they're too wrinkled looking, but any of the classic, particularly those that were bred in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Right, okay. I was going to throw you another curveball then, actually. You may know the answer or you may not. But what is the oldest variety that we know about from the UK?
Well, in the National Fruit Collection, which is at Brogdale over near Maidstone in Kent, which is like a living library of all the varieties in this country, there is one called the Decio, which is said to have come over with the Romans. Not a lot of paperwork to prove it, but theoretically, that I guess would count as the oldest. But there are quite a few, like Catshead and so on, which go back to medieval times and are still with us.
So what made you write the book?
I got enthused by an extraordinarily beautiful book called The Herefordshire Pomona, which was compiled in the 1870s and 1880s by a little local naturalists club in Herefordshire called the Woolhope Naturalists Field Club, and they still meet and thrive even today. And they were worried about the apples that they were seeing out on their walks, but weren't available in the shops. So they thought they would promote local apples, which they did. They had shows and so on. And then they thought, let's compile a pomona. Now, you probably know that Pomona is the Roman goddess of the orchards. And just like you have a Florilegium for flowers, a beautiful flower book. So at that time, pomonas were very popular and beautifully illustrated books of fruit. So they started off, and it was all very modest to begin with, and then they got more excited and more ambitious. And so after several years, this pomona ended up as, I think, 7 volumes, very large format, over 400 apples and pears in them, detailed descriptions about each variety. And these descriptions are still used today to help identify lost varieties. But it's the paintings which are so lovely. And they were done by 2 young women. One of them, Edith, was the daughter of Dr. Henry Bull, who put together the whole pomona, and who was an amazingly energetic man. And she and a woman called Alice Ellis, who was a very talented watercolourist and who trained in London at the Bloomsbury Art School, except for, I think, 1 or maybe two of these apples and pears, they painted them all. And so I've always, I'm a great gardener and I've always grown fruit, but I was captivated by these volumes when I first saw them. And so discussed it with Bodleian Publishing, and we came up with the book.
And how accurate are the illustrations? I'm guessing very, if people are still using them for identification purposes.
Yes, very, basically. I mean, apples do vary hugely, but these mostly were painted from life, from the show bench. So, and done, over many years, 7 or 8 years, I think it took to put the whole pomona together. But they're actual apples rather than being, say, a composite. If you look in a bird identification book, usually you get the perfect bird posing nicely, like you never see them. But because they are, I mean, there's one apple there called Best Pool, and it's got really rather unattractive blotches over it. Well, not every Best Pool looks like that, but the one that they painted did. So that's what it looks like in the book.
Yeah, I love that they captured them, warts and all.
Yeah.
It's great. So why should we grow heritage varieties, or why should we care about them today?
Well, two reasons really. One is completely selfish, and the other is rather more altruistic. The selfish reason is there are so many apples out there that you just can't buy in the shops. And, it's fine to, if you can just happy with Coxes and Bramleys and the regular, I don't know what, a dozen you might find in a supermarket these days. But there are over 2,000 possibilities, and they are all so different. I mean, you take something like a Norfolk beefing, and it's rich and meaty and completely different when it's baked from how a Bramley is. And an Ashmead's kernel, say, you pick it off the tree and you taste it and it's yummy. You store it away for a month or so and it tastes different again. So, and if you leave it on the tree and pick it much later, it tastes different from yet again. So it is that sheer variety that we are missing out on if we don't grow our own. Now, the more altruistic reason for growing these is to prevent them from disappearing altogether, because commercial growers have, understandably been driven by the economics of concentrating on varieties that tick a lot of boxes. They crop well, they all look the same, they don't bruise or rot in transit and so on. But, and it's a big but, apples, not just ones in this country, are being bred from a small gene pool. The same varieties are being interbred. And because apples don't come true from seed, all trees are vegetatively grafted. So the individuals essentially are identical. They're not bringing anything new to the party with each generation, which means, although that means the strengths are identical, so the weaknesses. Do you mind if I divert a bit into bananas at this point?
No, go for it.
Well, bananas give us a little warning from history. There are many, many varieties of banana, but for the past century, very few have been grown commercially. And for years, the dominant variety was the Gros Michel, which was known as Big Mike. But in the 50s, a lethal form of wilt called Panama disease swept through banana world. And it pretty much wiped out Big Mike and devastated the banana industry. But for reasons of their own, instead of diversifying, growers switched to another single variety, the Cavendish, which is what we see today. And because almost every banana we see on the shelves is identical to every other, isn't it? And now that's also under threat from another form of Panama disease, and that could just easily get wiped out. And, well, we know very well how pandemics can spread and kill. And there's absolutely no reason why the same sort of disaster couldn't blight our apples. And so one insurance policy is to make sure we don't have all our eggs in one basket. So if there is a crisis, there's a good chance that some of these lesser known varieties will prove resistant and come in and save the day.
Yeah, I get why they would have fallen out of favour commercially, because obviously growers, as you say, are looking for uniformity and for characteristics that suit being stocked in shops and things. But is there another reason why the heritage varieties have fallen out of favour in smaller gardens and smaller orchards?
Well, just because it's old doesn't mean to say it's good. I mean, some of these old varieties were woolly and tasteless. Quite a few were very prone to lots of pests and diseases. So there were good reasons not to grow them and to embrace new varieties as they came along. But also a matter of taste as well. We like now generally a crisper apple, and so the rather soft, what we would call flabby or flaccid apples, they've fallen out of favour. There was an initiative called the National Apple Congress back in 1883, and that is also one of the reasons. It did a huge service to the industry, but also a huge disservice, as we're now finding, because it cut back on the varieties that people were growing. Had you heard about the National Apple Congress? No. It's at that time in the 1880s, there were a huge variety of apples around, and people had been breeding them enthusiastically, and some were good, some were bad. A lot were mislabeled and misidentified. Everything was all in a bit of a muddle. And it was also about this time that the Americans, who'd been breeding their own apples, started exporting them back to Britain, and the British public thought these were wonderful, these huge American new apples. And so they were also worried about promoting British apples, because the British apple growers were missing out and were worried that their market would collapse. So the RHS decided they would have an apple congress, and they would ask all the growers in the country to send in samples of apples. And it wasn't a competition or anything. They just wanted to know which ones worked best where, and whether apple A and apple B were actually different or whether they were the same, and to bring some sort of order to the muddle of names and to find out which ones were best, and to encourage growers then to concentrate on those rather than, a million other ones. And it was hugely successful. They held it at their grounds, which were then in Chiswick, and huge, great marquee. The public came along. They had to extend the opening time because the queues were so long. And it did exactly what they intended. It showed up which ones were the best. It rekindled a huge enthusiasm for homegrown apples. And a committee of judges drew up a list of the 120 top apples, 60 dessert and 60 cookers. And so the message that went out to growers was, okay, boys, we'll just concentrate on these. We won't bother with the rest. And so at that point, all those that didn't make the cut really weren't considered worth growing at all.
That's interesting. I would have guessed that process of selection was to a degree subjective. So, it makes you wonder how accurate that kind of top list was?
Oh, of course, yes. Quite subjective, although it wasn't as though it was one person's taste.
No.
And it was a lot of considerations that the same apples grown in different parts of the country. And one of the apple that came second in the desserts was Cox's Orange Pippin, which of course, is still very highly regarded today. And it came second rather than first, not because it wasn't generally considered really top apple, but because it grew better in some regions than others, and it didn't thrive as well in, the colder northwestern, wetter parts of the country. So it sort of lost a few marks from that. The other thing which is quite interesting about the list is the three top cookers. Now, question for you. Okay, what's the first cooker that comes to mind for you?
Bramley.
I should think 99 people out of 100, that would be the answer, wouldn't it? The top three out of the Congress were Lord Suffield, Dumoulin Seedling, and Keswick Codlin. No mention of Bramley. It was well thought of. It got an honourable mention, but wasn't considered in the top 60 even.
Wow. So very, very subjective even though it's by committee, still obviously open to debate.
Yeah. The influence it had, whether subjective or not, is that lots of, very good apples were just cast aside.
Yeah, that's a shame. And it's interesting how they are quite region specific. And for that reason, I picked a few to talk about that you mentioned in the book, just because I thought they had really interesting backstories and are particularly specific to a region. So would you mind just chatting about a couple of those?
Let me think. The one that springs to mind straight away is Beauty of Kent, because Kent is one of the big apple counties, and it was where I was born. And Beauty of Kent is a lovely rosy cooker, and it was particularly popular in the 19th century. It's good to grow, it's well behaved, and it stores well. But I actually wanted to include it in the book, particularly because it's got a slightly odd association. It is believed by some to be the same as an old French variety called Rambourg Franc. And America has got several big red apples which are descended from Rambourg Franc. And there, Rambourg has become Rambo. Now, when I was, you can see what's coming, can't you? When I kept reading that this is where Rambo, as in Sylvester Stallone, our all-action hero, got his name. Well, you know how stories get picked up and repeated, especially on the internet, until they become a false truth. And I thought it sounded pretty unlikely. But I thought I'd check it out, so I contacted David Morrell, who was the creator of Rambo, and asked him. And it really is true. Apparently, he was writing his first book, but hadn't yet come up with a name for his character. And then one morning, his wife returns from market with a big bag of Rambo apples. So some of these urban myths are actually true.
Wow, that's fantastic. I love that you went the extra mile and actually wrote to the guy that wrote it.
Well, I was so pleased he got back to me, because I would have left it out of the book otherwise.
And the other one that I love the name of is Catshead, and I also love the shape of it. I mean, it's just really unusual. Is that particularly historic?
Oh, yes, it's a very old variety. Indeed, it probably goes back to the time of the Tudors. And there are quite a few apples that have got names that supposedly describe what they look like. Cat's head is also known as pig snout, and there's duck's bill and dog nose. I mean, you do have to use your imagination a bit, but I think these apples got their funny animal names because instead of being, if you imagine cutting one through as a cross section, instead of being round, they are rather ribbed. And so where these ribs gather at the end opposite from the stalk, it does look a bit like a pointy animal nose. So I guess that's where these all come from.
Mm. And going up to the sort of other end of the country from Beauty of Kent, can you just chat very briefly about Oslin as well?
Oslin's a real oddity. It's a Scottish apple, although it probably came over from France originally, maybe with French monks, but it's now considered Scottish through and through. And it's specifically associated with Arbroath. In fact, you often see it called Arbroath Oslin or Arbroath Pippin. And if you go up to Arbroath, there are Oslins planted near the Applegate, which is close to where Arbroath Abbey's orchards were once planted. But one of the things that makes it stand out, and this is its oddity, is that it develops little bumpy knots along its branches. And these burrs, as they're called, can be encouraged to send out roots. So Oslin is one of the very few apples that it's possible to propagate from cuttings rather than grafting.
That's unusual.
Yeah, very, very unusual. It's also, there's a little bit of modern history. After the Olympics, a new orchard was created on the Olympic site called the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And 55 fruit trees were planted there after the Olympics. And each of the gold medal winners in the Paralympics chose a fruit tree to represent them. And the Scottish champion cyclist, Neil Fahey, chose an Oslin.
Wow.
So you can see one in London.
Brilliant. And do they grow okay in London?
To be honest, I don't know because it's only been there 5 years. So early days. So, but Auslan is, and this is again extraordinary that it did thrive up in Scotland because it's one of the very, very early flowerers. But it seems to survive all right, yeah.
Wow. And I mean, the good thing about the book is that all of them that you talk about have got their own story, and they're all, they're just all brilliant, and it does lend an extra kind of layer of interest to the varieties.
Thank you.
And what I thought was also interesting, and I don't expect that you exhaustively tasted all of them, but I did wonder, did you get to taste some of the heritage varieties?
Oh, I certainly did, yes, but no, not all of them. There are people out there, who have made it almost their life's work. But I tasted enough that it really brought home to me how very different they are, one from the other. And I was very recently down at the Newt in Somerset, which is a very new. It's a luxury spa hotel, but it has its own orchard and cider press and so on. And we did a little bit of tasting there, and it was just astonishing. One of my favourite apples, which has actually originated quite close to where I live in Sussex, is called Golden Pippin, and it has got a slightly pineapple-y taste to it. And the one I tried down in the Newt the other day, rather similar. I think they've probably got a similar ancestry. It was called Barnett d'ananas, so a pineapple rennet, and again it was small and yellow, and it had this little aftertaste of pineapple, which I've discovered I rather like.
So if people are thinking of planting any heritage varieties in their gardens or orchards, where might they go to taste them? Is it just a case of tracking down someone who's growing that particular variety?
There are plenty of people out there growing. Once you start looking, there are community orchards. If you go to the, oh goodness, I forgot what it stands for, PTES website, it I think it's just ptes.org.uk, the Orchard Project, they have an interactive map where you can feed in where you might want to find a community orchard, and it comes up with all those within X miles. Very often community orchards concentrate on local varieties, which of course is rather nice. And then places like the National Trust, they've got, I think something like 200 heritage orchards in their care. The RHS gardens. Now, in normal years, and of course with Apple Day coming up, I'd be saying to you enthusiastically, oh, everyone should go out and go to their local Apple Day events. But they just ain't happening this year, of course. But farmers markets are still up and running at the moment, and they again often have varieties that you don't see in the shops. And again, coming down to local varieties, ask around. Local farm shops, neighbours, the community orchards I've already mentioned, garden societies, anyone who grows apples usually has a surplus, and they're really happy to talk and share. So I think put the question out there.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I know our local National Trust is Bateman's, which is the home of Rudyard Kipling, or was the home.
Yes.
And they've got some old varieties, and they just at the end of the year bag them up and sell them from the front gate. So yes, it definitely can be done. Before I let you go, I know this is a big topic, but I know it is a one that's sometimes a bit tricky. Could you briefly touch on pollination and what people need to look out for? I don't know whether you can do it briefly, but as much of an overview as you could give, please.
Sure, right. It's one of those things that some people just never give another thought to, and others get their knickers in a real twist about it. The reason pollination has to be thought of at all is because, unlike a lot of other fruits like peaches or plums, most apples can't fertilize themselves from their own pollen. So they need another variety, not just another tree of the same variety nearby with which to cross-pollinate. And so bees need to come along at the right time and be able to transfer pollen from one variety to another, which means the flowers need to be at the same stage of development for that to happen. So although apples blossom from the middle of April right through to the end of May, beginning of June, they're not all in perfect fertility condition at the same time. And in fact, although blossom on a particular tree will stick around for 2 or 3 weeks, it's only 3 or 4 days in the middle of that time that they're actually at their optimum to be fertilized, which gets people worried because, how on earth can I find that little window of opportunity and choose which trees to pair with other trees? But realistically, you can't go by specific dates because there could be a month's lag from a variety in Scotland after that same variety down here in Sussex or Somerset or somewhere like that. But people have come up with the idea of pollination groups, A to F or G, or 1 to 6, denoting whether they're early or late. And so you could choose 2 varieties which were both labelled B, say, or 3 or 4, and you know that they would come out at the same time and do the work for each other. And because there is an overlap, usually you can take, if something is labelled C, it would be happy to cross-pollinate with B or D. Well, so far so good, but these classifications are not really cut and dried, and so you'll find one supplier calls his a B and somebody else might call it 2, or they might call it a 3, or it might get labelled B/C. And there's a total of 7 groups that people have devised, and then other people have said, no, it's only early, middle, late, that's all you need to know. And then somebody else comes along and mentions triploids, and triploids are apples which have 3 sets of chromosomes rather than just the usual 2. So they need 2 different pollinators. And it's at this point where you begin to go off the whole idea and reach for a large drink. But in real life, most of the apples fall into a middle category, and they flower pretty much in the middle of the blossom season, and they overlap quite satisfactorily. So even if you're only growing a single tree, there are probably other compatible apple trees, in neighbours' gardens or in a local park. And crab apples can also be helpful with pollination. So it's unlikely that you're going to be in a very isolated position. If there are no other trees around, then yes, you will need to provide your own, to have at least 2 or ideally more for cross-pollination. More likely is it becomes a question if you've got one which flowers either very late or very early. There's a lovely old variety called Courpin du Plat, which often waits until June until it flowers, by which time all the other apples that might be around it have already set their fruit. But that is an exception, and usually it's the early flowering, I mentioned Oslin earlier, that are more of a problem, because not only are not many other apples around, but there aren't many pollinating insects around as well early in the year. So if you have set your heart on something that is very early flowering, then it is worth doing a bit of homework to find another variety that is likely to be out at the same time. There is the option of there are self-fertile or partially self-fertile varieties. They're inclined to be the newer rather than heritage apples. And even then, it's better, you'll get a better crop if you can pollinate from another tree rather than relying on the pollen from the same tree. You can get things called a family tree. You've probably come across them, where 2 or 3 varieties are grafted onto a single trunk, which seem like an answer from heaven if you've got a very, very small garden. But I have found that as the tree matures, and unless you're very careful and assiduous with the pruning, and of course pruning is a whole other subject we won't go into now, one variety is inclined over the years to dominate, and the others just die back and give up the ghost.
Right.
Having said that, there is a man, in fact lives just down the road from me, who hit the news a few years back because he had successfully grafted, you ready for this, 250 varieties onto the same trunk.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't think he had a problem with pollination.
So if in doubt about pollination, just graft yourself 250 varieties onto one tree. And in case you're wondering, the gardener who did that was Paul Barnett from Chidham in West Sussex. Many thanks to Caroline for talking about apples, and thanks to you for listening. To finish, here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about those long-legged lolloping wallies that have been flying into me both indoors and out for the past few weeks.
Leather jackets are what we call the soil-dwelling grubs of long, dangly-legged flies known as crane flies or daddy longlegs. The grubs are tubular, greyish-brown in colour, and have no legs or visible heads. They develop from eggs that the adult crane flies usually lay into lawns at the end of summer, and throughout autumn the young leather jackets feed on grass roots before hibernating underground over winter. Come spring, the leather jackets resume feeding, often causing unsightly patches of dead and dying grass across the lawn before they pupate in mid-summer. After a couple of weeks, the next generation of adult craneflies emerge to mate and then reinfest their eggs back into the lawn. An interesting fact is that whilst leather jackets are developing within a lawn, they live in vertical shafts. When the weather is dry, they are at the bottom of the shaft, but when wet, they are at the top. Birds such as starlings and crows love to eat leather jackets, so by keeping your lawn regularly watered during the summer months, the grubs will always be at the top of the shafts and within easy reach for the birds.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.